My name is Steve Monroe. I'm the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for Marsh. I am going to be the moderator for today's presentation, which is brought to you by the Connecticut Economic Recovery Working Group, and the Connecticut Business and Industry Association is also a member of that working group. I would be remiss if I did not recognize the co-chair, Stan Sorkin of the Connecticut Food Association, Michael Lettieri, the Director of the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, George Bradner, the Connecticut Insurance Department, and of course our gracious hosts from the CBIA, Bonnie Stewart, Tony Holmes, and Dave Conrad. The copies of this presentation, as well as the very helpful checklist that's being referenced in these material and is also referenced at the very end of this presentation, will be provided to everybody via email after the event. But you'll also see the links to the checklist at the end of this presentation. I would encourage you to post your questions, and we'll try to address them as we proceed through the presentation. Otherwise, we'll catch up at the end. Our panelists today, very proud to present Jed McPherson and Brett Gilman. Jed joined Marsh, which is the world's leading insurance broker, in 2000. He's a consultant. He focused his career on investigative accounting and the measurement of damages with respect to property losses, and specifically in connection to FEMA recoveries. Services include investigating FEMA claims, insurance claims, fidelity loss analysis, construction claims, fraud claims, and loss of earning calculations. Brett is with Marsh since 1997. He was in the London office. He was in our Dubai office. He's most recently in our Connecticut and our Atlanta offices. And Brett focuses on providing property and construction insurance needs to some of our major U.S.-based clients. So today's presentation, we're going to focus on these areas. We're going to do a little bit of looking back and sort of planning ahead. We're going to review your property insurance policy and try to identify key tripwires. We'll evaluate property loss control and property security, how to plan for employee safety, evaluate claims preparedness and management issues, and then we'll do a quick recap at the end. So, for all of us on this call, Superstorm Sandy is actually a very fresh memory in our minds. It is the largest Atlantic hurricane on record. It was devastating. It was deadly. Impacted states from Florida to Maine. And Governor Malloy issued road closures in all state highways, an unprecedented event. And this particular claim has been taken off, Sandy has been taken off the list of hurricane names permanently. Look at the total global property loss over the last few years, from 2009 to 2013. This is the distribution by the total value of those losses. And what's sort of interesting about this chart is if you look at fire, it's 28% as the largest single by property loss value catastrophic event. And I would say that, when you're preparing for a disaster, disaster can be something that is as simple as one fire that impacts many, many downstream industries, as well as downstream employees and other people that are attached to a single business. This is an interesting statistic. 40% of businesses do not reopen after disaster. And a lot of that is due to the inability to get cash flowing in a timely manner to that business to help them recover. Very often one of the largest early needs for funds relates to just getting the debris removed and getting that the ability to go back in and start the reconstruction. But if you don't have the appropriate insurance in place and you don't have a very proactive partners with you to help you get the money coming in from your insurance carrier, you may not ever be able to recover. And another 25% fail within 1 year after the disaster. Just looking back at Connecticut's history over the past 5 years, it's sort of interesting to see the number of actually hurricanes that have impacted the area, as well as the severe winter storms, which we're all way too familiar with, and all the impacts that has on downed power lines, something that we'll be focusing on in this particular presentation, by making sure that you do have that kind of coverage available to you, and that you're aware of the restrictions that may be imposed when you do have power outage coverage. It may not actually be triggered if you don't have the right distance, or it's within a certain period of time that is excluded from coverage. So let's take a look at your policy, and I'll pass this over to Brett.
Thanks, Steve. As we go through the sort of top tripwires in the profit policy, I think the central message as we go through the next slides really is that it's critical to understand how the policy is going to respond prior to the loss event. There's three key things. Obviously, it sounds very commonsensical, but managing expectations within your organisation, identifying concerns or coverage items that could perhaps then be addressed and adjusted prior to loss, and recognizing that large losses are going to be complex, regardless of how well one is prepared. So to be able to avoid major or fundamental coverage disputes or challenges really allows organizations to focus their resources and efforts on the recovery and the actual claims process. An interesting recent statistic that I became aware of is that about less than 25% of insured have reviewed or tested how their policy may respond in the last 2 years. So there's a survey that was conducted, I think, by a risk consulting group. And it just sort of gets to the point that we talk a lot about testing for contingency, take the very basic things, every building pretty much has a fire drill on a regular basis. But when it comes to insurance policies, knowing how they may or may not respond, running that sort of scenario testing, trying to identify potential ambiguities, if you like, or disputes that could come up relative to language, is something that's not as widely utilized within the business organization. So as we go through the details, that's kind of the high-level message that trying to portray here. Just talking through these in order: business interruption, again, understanding what is going to be covered, how it's going to be covered, what's the risk to the calculation that may apply. Typically that's going to be on an actual loss sustained basis. But again, depending on the nature of business, it might be a better approach to be looking at a per diem type calculation if one's able to calculate that pre-negotiation of policy and structural policy wording accordingly. Contingent business interruption. This is most of the downstream suppliers of suppliers and customers. So if they have an event at their location, how does that impact your business income earning ability? And understanding supply chains are complex these days. The difference between a direct supplier or direct customer and an indirect supplier or customer, and the recognition that many insurance policies might provide some level of coverage for direct suppliers or customers, but often they will exclude indirect, or they will further supplement the available coverage for indirect. And definitions, this is a particularly higher focus coming out of Sandy. Really understanding definitions of some of these critical catastrophe perils. Flood and mega windstorm are the most pertinent items, and that really comes down to where storm surge is. Is that going to be in a flood? Is it going to be at the end of the day windstorm? Recognizing how policies are structured, typically you're all benefiting from full limits for the named windstorm, and typically you're seeing sublimits on an aggregated basis for flood. So understanding where and how the policy is going to respond versus the actual event is key going into any renewal season prior to losses. Understanding too how supplements will operate. Oftentimes you see a policy has got the supplements for what I call the perils, so flood or earthquake or named windstorm if one is suffering a supplement for that. But then you also have the supplements for the additional ancillary coverages for extra expense, service interruption, and civil authority. And really understanding that those supplements are going to be governed by the operating peril. So if the flood is what's causing those losses and the flood limit is $2.5 million. Even if your other sublimits for extra flooding expense or extra expense are $5 million, $10 million, or 15, the maximum one's going to recover from that flood occurrence is going to be based on the flood sublimit of $2.5 million. The civil authority ingress egress, distance limitation against physical damage is going to be the trigger for accident risk coverage, so I'd say how policies can respond. Is the distance limitation, is it 1 mile, is it 5 miles, are you able to avoid a distance limitation? And then the number of days, periods that you like to receive indemnity for those coverages. I skipped over the service interruption there, apologies. But again, an extension of coverage, physical damage occurring at the utility that's causing a subsequent business income interruption to your business. Again, that typically is going to be a sublimited coverage, but we've certainly seen claims where that interruption of the utility can very quickly cause very significant income interruption to an insurer's business. Again, understanding what is the supplement that's supplying and how that's going to respond, and understanding how that fits in with one's business to determine whether or not there's an ability to negotiate for additional coverage pre-event.
Right, and then the service interruption piece, there's an interesting dispute that arose out of Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, when it hit southern Manhattan. The power was shut down, quote-unquote, voluntarily in order to sort of anticipate a broader problem that might have happened had they not shut it down, and there was some kind of dispute over whether or not there was a triggered event there. And I just thought it would be another thing to be aware of is that you might have service interruption, but not all events that have a service interruption element have the appropriate trigger under the policy.
That's a good point, Steve. I think that also applies equally to the sort of the civil authority ingress side of things. And I think there's no, I would say, no black or white answer. Each insurer likely has a different perspective, and depending on the policy language, some insurers may have been successful in creating arguments for elements of claims recovery. So again, I think that's, those are, I'd say that those are, all the sort of questions and the scenarios that we're looking at. How will my policy respond? Is in fact determining what are really unlikely but still realistic scenarios. It's not of huge benefit to come up with wild scenarios trying to set your policy. It's going to probably tell you not. But trying to understand what are those likely scenarios that would or could impact my organisation. And walking that through with one's insurance advisor, and if necessary with one's insurance carrier. Again, each insurer has a different business, and the idea of insurance is to try and tailor that to meet the business needs of the individual businesses as opposed to taking off-the-shelf products and hoping they apply appropriately.
But we have a question that has come in, interesting question, may need some clarification, but it comes in from Frank. It says, are there discounts available if the insured has installed early warning and notification products or software?
That is a good question. I would say that there's as part of negotiating the insurance coverage, being able to explain to the insurers all of the mitigation that an insured can and does operate under will ensure the most competitive terms and conditions and of course pricing. I wouldn't say that it's menu oriented, but again, depending on the space, I imagine as one got into some of the smaller more off-the-shelf type insurance policies, then potentially. But I think that sounds like it's more of an opportunity to explain to the insurance carriers that are quoting for your business, what are the risk management benefits and distinguishing features associated with that organization.
Thank you. I think there were two areas here you might finish up on this slide, the wide area impact, but what does that really mean? And then the deductible application.
Yeah, certainly. So wide area impact, this is at a high level, I don't want to get too deep in this, it's the concept that, in a very large event, and Katrina, I think, is probably the Hurricane Katrina is probably the easiest example, where there's, the sort of concept that some insurers might take is that the whole area was impacted. So even if you had not suffered physical damage yourself, your business income was going to be lower. So again, that's going to be somewhat dependent on the type of industry one's in. But the argument really is saying that yes, you suffered physical damage, but if you hadn't suffered physical damage, and if didn't have a business interruption claim associated with that as well, your business income would not have been what it was, because the area was so badly devastated or hit that there was no business going on in that area, or no one was coming into that area, and therefore, they would seek to adjust the claim, and Jeff certainly appreciate if you have any thoughts to jump in here, but they would seek to adjust the claim based on what would have transpired, as opposed to what, where you thought your business was going, pre the entire event. So not all insurers take the same view. It's a slightly interesting topic. It can be challenging. An insurance company, certainly one that I've spoken to about this, they will argue that it goes both ways. So you may be able to recover more because you actually were going to be benefiting. So hotels are kind of an interesting example there, where a hotel would have been almost at full occupancy because of all of the consultants, all of the adjusters and everything else that was coming in to town. And so they'll sell you on the fact that it works both ways. But I guess my point being is it's just something to understand. And again, looking at scenario testing, how policy will respond, is understanding how does my insurer adjust the VI claim, and how could that impact my recovery. So
yeah, just to jump in there real quick to reinforce a lot of what you just mentioned. Typically, it's very difficult to make a business interruption claim that's linked to a loss of market share. Like Brett mentioned, it really goes both ways. And so when you calculate the business interruption period, you typically forecast what sales would have been based on historical levels. And so you project those sales, and then you compare them to actual sales during the restoration period. And if you have an extended period of indemnity, the policy typically allows you maybe 30 to 60 or 90 days to ramp up, to get your production levels back up to normal levels, to get your sales back to where they were before. If during that period or beyond that period of indemnity, if sales do not return due to market share, typically that's not a covered trigger. But what we've seen in a practical sense when you work through the adjustment process is the adjustment team will look at post-sales and consider makeup sales. If, let's say, you've got a business in a disaster zone that is rewarded by additional traffic from first responders, like the hotel example, then they may apply that increased sales when compared to historical levels as an offset to whatever your lost revenue can be. So it can definitely be tricky when you're dealing with lost market share.
Thanks, Jeff. I spend a lot of time on this slide. Deductible applications, again, it's important to understand how they apply. Per occurrence, do you have deductibles applied per location? So if flood insurance is be an area to focus on, you could have multiple deductibles that are going to add up together in the event. And certainly there's one deductible applied per occurrence for both physical damage and the time element, business income side of the loss, or do you have separate deductibles applying? And therefore understanding what is my total out of pocket likely to be in any given scenario. So just very quickly, so just recap, business interruption, you have physical damage to premises because of the loss of income. You're going to have that period of indemnity which runs from the point when that damage starts to when the physical damage is repaired or replaced. In a reasonable time frame. And then after that, then you'll probably see on the insurance policies if it's an extended period of indemnity or extended period of liability, typically stated as a number of days. Ideally 265 days, but you may see less than that, 180, maybe 90. And that's really giving you the opportunity, once you're back up and running, to get your business back up to those levels that it was pre-loss. And then we mentioned before, I think, the contingent BI, direct and indirect. So it's important to understand that, direct and indirect, not only is there obviously an obvious difference, but sometimes there may be a situation where it looks like someone's a direct supplier, but in reality they're being viewed as an indirect supplier. So again, just an important area to understand if that's critical to your business operation.
Yeah, and then on that point, I would just say look very closely at the contract you signed with your quote-unquote direct supplier and make sure they're actually direct and they're not getting the supplies you need through another actual supplier that is more direct.
So I think, Jeff, I'll probably ask you to jump in here. And we've got a few examples of some losses and some sort of key points to sort of to raise as we go through these cuts. Perhaps we can sort of go over these next two or three, Jeff.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Brett. So these are examples from recent disasters where real experiences may help you develop a disaster preparedness plan tailored to fit your needs and operations. This first example was a city and county government loss where our claim prep team was involved in helping them measure and quantify the loss. They sustained about a $100 million flood loss due to some flood sublimits within their policies for facilities that were located in a special flood hazard area. They only received $52 million from insurance, and so there was a huge $48 million exposure that fortunately was pursued through FEMA because this was declared a disaster. And so we were able to pursue that uninsured loss through FEMA's public assistance program. But absent that declaration, this particular city would have been staring at a significant exposure that really would have been difficult for them to overcome. So when it comes to, reviewing your coverage, I encourage all of you to consider mock disaster scenarios so that maybe you can flush out some vulnerable exposures and then marry those exposures to your existing policy limits so you can determine if you carry, adequate coverage. Today, there's some really impressive analytical type tools that allow some really neat modeling. I encourage you to challenge your insurance broker to help you, model those exposures so you can identify what they are and how they line up to your policy limits. Another example of hurdles that seem to surface in every major loss event are code standards for reconstruction. When we talk about your disaster recovery team later, someone from the permitting department certainly needs a seat at that leadership table. Typically, the insurance policy requires that codes be enforced at the time of the loss. FEMA has a similar criteria where they want to confirm and validate that, there's precedent when it comes to codes. And then, unfortunately, a lot of these codes are born from the actual loss event, especially after a flood loss where you have elevation requirements. And so it's important that, your permitting directors review that language in the policy so that if there's any tweaking on either side so that you can demonstrate that certain codes were in place prior to the loss event so that you don't miss out on any recovery opportunities here. Another vulnerable area is debris. In this particular loss, debris represented about 10% of the total $100 million claim. So, you're talking $10 million in debris costs since it was such a widespread, impactful flood disaster. And in this particular policy, debris had a sublimit. Again, fortunately, FEMA was there to pick up the losses in excess of the sublimit, but it's important to really study and review those sublimits and compare those to your actual, operations to determine if there's any vulnerable areas. The interplay between insurance and FEMA will drill down in later slides. I do want to talk about documentation because as an accountant, that helps clients measure and support losses, it is absolutely critical in order for you to reach a speedy and complete recovery. In this particular loss, our claims team worked in a rather large conference room on site at the client's finance department for almost 2 years. And we collected enough documentation to fill up the conference room from floor to ceiling. And so we had to develop an electronic sort of digital warehouse to really organize and store this data so that it could be used and distributed to, various insurance adjustment parties and FEMA parties involved in the loss. And so as you consider your disaster recovery plan, I think it's important to factor in some kind of electronic or digital warehouse system where you can store documentation, because some of these losses take years to get through, and a lot of the key stakeholders may not be available to turn over critical information that they may keep, at their desk. And so being able to store at a central location is very important. The last bullet about FEMA's obtaining and maintaining insurance requirements is another important one that we'll talk about on later slides. So moving on to the next slide, this is just another example of why it's important to understand your coverage. This loss was a wind event where a private nonprofit low-income housing authority suffered a $25 million loss, and they had a per location wind deductible. Okay, so they had approximately 600 units in this apartment complex that were sort of built in clusters, and so each individual cluster that may consist of 10 to 20 different apartment units had its own per location wind deductible. And so every cluster and apartment was impacted, but unfortunately, or fortunately, when you look at it, the losses for each building didn't always exceed the policy per location deductible. And so of that $25 million, very little was recovered through insurance. Again, this was a FEMA declared disaster, and the private nonprofit low-income housing authority was eligible for FEMA assistance. But since they were a nonprofit, FEMA does have different guidelines for what types of assistance are available depending on the non-essential or essential criteria. Essential private nonprofits examples are education and hospitals. And you have the FEMA, this low-income housing authority was non-essential, meaning that FEMA would only provide emergency work assistance. Well, the value of those emergency work losses did not exceed or did not erode enough of the insurance deductible, so they were still staring at significant uninsured exposure. So they went to the Small Business Administration to apply for a disaster loan, and based on their poor financial condition, they were denied this disaster loan, which then opened up this private nonprofit to be eligible for all FEMA categories. And they were able to recover the remaining uninsured deductible, at this point in time in the loss process. But it's important to understand that FEMA is a cost reimbursement program, and as many of you are aware, when you work through that public assistance process, it's very tedious, it's very lengthy, and so it's important, like Steve mentioned before, to consider some emergency cash reserves in your plan, because the FEMA reimbursement payments will lag, and so, without any type of emergency rainy day type fund so that you can, get your operations back up and running, it may be difficult for you to recover from this event. Before we move on to the next slide, I do think it's important to emphasize the Small Business Administration allowances for disaster loans. This is a very important avenue for assistance that's available through the SBA.gov. They offer long-term disaster loans at competitive market prices, and it could be the difference between you being a failure statistic on that, one of those early slides, or recovering and no longer being a business going concern. So with that, Ben, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. So very quickly, the NFIP National Flood Insurance Program Just a couple of points here that perhaps worth pointing out. Condominiums, there are different eligibility requirements. The real message here is that you need to understand the bylaws of the condominium association and the responsibilities within that, and that really then sort of dictates what insurance is available under the NFIP. NFIP, I'm sure most are aware, it's not a perfect solution. Typically it's used to sort of buy down larger flood deductibles than on an all-risk property policy. But the coverage is on a per building basis. It only provides coverage for buildings and contents. There's no business interruption insurance available under NFIP, and it's an actual cash value basis of indemnity as opposed to replacement cost. So it's certainly valuable, and in many instances a requirement to purchase NFIP if one is in the high hazard flood zone. But it certainly shouldn't be seen as an absolute panacea. Just very quickly on this, I touched on it a little bit earlier. This is an example of a claim, $300 million plus hurricane loss. I think it really came down to where's the storm surge, is it flood or is it wind? If the definitions are unclear or lacking, you can have some coverage disputes. And that leads on to some of the points I made earlier about slow claim advances. A lot of resources going into the claim, at the same time as also trying to recover from a major event. Again, understanding which flood zones these locations are in, understanding whether one is partially in a flood zone, and how does that impact the policy. There'll be many policies that might suggest that if a location is partially in a high-hazard flood zone, then the sub-language applies to the entire location. So again, very important to try and understand exactly what is exposed to flood and how the policy is going to respond. Speed moving to the next slide, perhaps. Just another example of a healthcare business. Again, just about understanding the policies of premises service interruption. Client believes that if they didn't get power, they will be able to make a claim under the policy. Again, it's critical. The coverage has to be relative to property damage that suffered at the utility location in order to be tripping covered under the property policy. And then I think the only other point here on service interruption, I think, is just to point out that you're likely to have business limitation potentially. There's certainly probably going to be a waiting period that's going to apply. It might be substantial. 24 hours, I'd say, is very typical. Again, understanding what that might mean and how quickly one's losses can round up in that short period of time. There may be exclusions for key perils, so earthquake and or flood might be an excluded peril under the policy. So it's really about understanding, do all these coverages, do all these ancillary coverages that I'm receiving under my policy, albeit with sub-limits, are they going to apply in all events, or am I going to have a problem with a flood or an earthquake that's triggering what we call the operating peril for that event? Overhead transmission distribution lines, again, really important in the Northeast. Typically going to be excluded from a policy once a T&D line is 1,000 feet away from the location. Again, important to understand that if that is a critical area of business that's going to be substantial, again, worth that conversation as to whether there are any solutions in the marketplace. It is an area that's tricky. There's not a lot of insurance solutions available. But again, it's being aware and having that proactive conversation with one's insurance providers to fully establish what one's risk transfer options may or may not be. Lastly, on the deductibles, again, talk about per occurrence. Maybe there's an aggregate deductible which puts a total cap on what your out-of-pocket may be during a policy period. But then also understanding how would deductibles operate if flood event, we're going to have probably a higher dollar deductible. It may even be a percentage deductible that's applied to flood, and almost certainly for a high hazard Tier 1, Tier 2 named windstorm, you'd like to see a percentage applied to your values. So again, it's important to understand what is that before the loss? When a percentage deductible is in play, it can be difficult to get to a dollar quantum on that, which again hurts when it comes to expectation management. Much trickier to try and explain that the day after the major event, as opposed to explaining it up front once the policy is renewed, so it has an expectation going into losses. So I think, Steve, with that, conscious like we've eaten up a fair amount of time, probably hand back to Jed to talk a little bit more about
Okay, thank you, Brett. So Section 3 focuses on the evaluation of property loss control and property security. This first slide is, who's on your recovery team? I can tell you from helping applicants and policyholders through major claim processes, the coordination efforts are enormous. And it's important to identify, all the key players and leadership stakeholders and get them at the table so that you can make real-time decisions based on, information that becomes available after suffering through a major loss event. So establishing a coordination flow chart between those key personnel is extremely important. Down at the bottom, you'll see just some general examples. It's important to have the central sort of gatekeeper point of contact. And from real experience, I've seen this individual either be someone with a police and emergency management background. In some cases, it's the risk manager. In other cases, it may be someone from the finance department. But obviously, that's a critical role that should be, well thought through before identifying who this central point of contact is. And then there's a number of other important departments that should have a seat at the table. Okay, you've got your risk management department, you've got your accounting, your purchasing and procurement, your facilities. We talked about your permitting, your codes and standards individuals. Your insurance adjustment team should have a seat at that table. Not that they're always there. We recommend that there be internal and external meetings. FEMA will certainly want to sit at the table, and your state of Connecticut Division of Emergency Management may also have a chair. As you work through this process, and especially if you're in a disaster zone, I think it's important to identify primary and secondary contact, because some of the primary contacts that you identify as being part of this leadership team may not be available. They could have suffered personal losses and are distracted, rightfully so, to those losses. And so having a secondary contact to fill that role is important. It's also important that you consider a system to distribute emergency information and protocols and procedures and forms throughout the disaster response period. I think IT comes to mind and should certainly have a seat at the table. Sometimes if you have power outages or cell towers being down, it's difficult to transfer information online. And so we've seen disaster plans before for larger public entities and private clients where, some of their key stakeholders have a disaster recovery manual. It's a hard copy, 3-binder version that they're required to carry in their car. So while they're operating in the dark offline, they still have access to their disaster protocols. And then once they come back online, they can start distributing information through their normal systems. It's also important to consider a command center location and even consider alternative meeting locations if the location that you identify is in the disaster zone and you can't access it. You need to be fluid and flexible so that you have a contingent plan B to meet, because you can get so much more accomplished meeting in person versus trying to communicate in other ways. Moving on to the next slide. This talks about emergency response vendors and standardizing the assessment process. I can't tell you how important it is to identify emergency response vendors. The examples include debris removal contractors. The FEMA has a new pilot program where there's incentives for public entities that complete the debris removal process within certain timelines. And I can tell you from experience, it's impossible to get your debris completed within these tight deadlines unless you have a debris removal contractor already in place that can hit the ground running as soon as it's safe to access your properties. Other emergency response vendors include restoration and remediation companies. You may want to bring in a roofing consultant to inspect your roofing systems. I think it's important to have a certified industrial hygienist contractor available. A lot of times they'll do the due diligence of telling the story to help demonstrate and justify the remediation and the restoration work that takes place. Typically, remediation companies have those certified industrial hygienists in-house at your access, but having an independent relationship between, an outside certified industrial hygienist to really kind of support, how many feet of drywall needed to be torn out of a building that was inundated with floodwaters, and it will help you maximize your recoveries of those remediation costs. Claim consulting is also another emergency response vendor I would consider. And so, before you get to this helter-skelter disaster response moment, I would take the time or encourage you to take the time to, put out RFPs and competitive procurement bids so that you can identify maybe a couple of companies within each emergency response category so that they're on call and just a simple phone call away to respond quickly to help you mitigate total losses. And I think that's key here. The faster you can get in and take on the reconstruction repairs, the sooner you're going to get back up and running. And the sooner that happens, the lower your total loss will be. And so these are all, eligible expenses typically for your insurance or through the FEMA process because you're mitigating your losses. These pre-disaster contracts also allow you to lock in competitive rates. If you wait until after a disaster happens to solicit one of these vendors, you're going to pay for it. So when you have the time before a disaster event to really scrub and do some quality background on, the different vendors that can help you, you can take advantage of locking into those pre-disaster rates. It's also important to establish some pre-loss checklists. I see that we've moved on to the debris removal consideration, so for time, I'll jump right ahead. We talked about debris constituting a significant portion of your total loss. This is a highly scrutinized area for both insurance and FEMA. FEMA wants to know the cradle to the grave story about debris, so they're going to request permitting documents. They want to make sure that you go to a licensed landfill. They're going to see all your load tickets. They will pay for debris monitoring, so if you're looking at a significant debris scope of work, there's debris monitoring companies that are qualified and have worked through the FEMA insurance process before, and those costs are typically built into the claim and reimbursed through insurance and or FEMA. So it's important to consider the resources, the external resources that are out there to help you clean up your debris so that you can access your properties accordingly. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Initial inspections and mitigation efforts. You're responsible for protecting your property from further damage. And so whether you do that internally or you bring in external contractors to perform those duties, it's something to think about before the event. We talked about the disaster response service companies already. You've got to board up windows or secure contents, and wind events, we typically see partial roof losses where the roof is peeled back and there may not be significant interior damage, but if you can't put a temporary roofing system on, you're going to suffer some additional damages. And so it's important to get a remediation company out there immediately to install that temporary roofing system until you can make permanent repairs to protect that property from additional damage. You may require security services to monitor buildings that, are offline for power reasons and therefore don't have the fire alarm system is offline. Again, that's a mitigating cost that can be built into your overall claim. The initial damage assessment is also important. It may take the adjustment team and or FEMA some time before they can get out to witness your actual damages. And so the sooner you can send a team out there to really capture your losses with pictures or video evidence, the greater recovery outcome you'll reach. You know, it's important to inspect all of your roofs, your basements, your windows, and to identify, you know, really facility-type project managers that understand your assets and the damages that those assets may have sustained, so that you can identify what those damages are, so that when the adjustment team does arrive, you can, you know, take them and to inspect those damaged locations. It's important that you meet with your vendors and contractors to establish tracking protocols and procedures. We'll get into that in the next slide. It's also important for you to develop internal controls when it comes to time and material contracts. You know, I've seen remediation companies that arrive on site that may have 50 laborers, you know, that participate in the cleanup and dry out efforts. And so what we recommend is that you create these internal control procedures to request the labor sheets so that you can do counts of the laborers that are actually working. That you request the equipment sheets if there's equipment being used, so that you can validate eventually what's going to be invoiced to you was actually used in the field. Moving on to the next slide, managing those vendors. We've touched on a lot of this, but it's extremely important that your contractors understand they should reference every building on any of their documents, whether it's proposals, invoices, or contracts. You know, it's important you track your losses on a building-by-building basis. And every proposal or contract or purchase order should have a disaster tag, a disaster-specific tag. In our Sandy losses, we would say, you know, Sandy. And so anytime there was a document that had Sandy on it, it would be captured in the claim and not fall through into normal operations. It's also important that you segregate your losses between debris removal, emergency protective measures, permanent repairs, and if you have a combination of wind and flood damage, the contractor needs to understand that they need to itemize the services they perform between wind-related services as well as flood-related services. It's also important to take photographs to track the stages of your repair process. So I think that finishes up Section 3, and I'll turn it over back to Brett for Section 4.
Thanks, Jeff. So, gosh, time. This slide is relatively straightforward, and I think it comes down to, as you read through these 10 points, it's relatively common sense items associated with people's safety. I think the main message here, though, this is the bit that our consultants would stress, is that making sure the plans remain current to your current operations, you know, whether it be the people, the contacts that need to be engaged in the event of loss. Testing the plans, again, common theme throughout this presentation is testing these items. And then communicating this so that everyone in the organization understands what the plan is going to be, and then obviously in the event of loss, executing upon those plans. I'm not going to read through all these items. I do think that the one towards the end of the list, sort of items 7, 8, and 9 in particular, and 10, just thinking outside of the immediate organization, but in terms of how you're unfortunately going to deal with a large event such as Sandy or Katrina back in the day, is going to be another important benefit that will inure to the business if the employees are in a better position, then they're likely to be back engaged in the business more quickly. So I think that's probably enough to sum up that slide. Steve, unless you had any particular items you wanted me to forward on there.
No, I think that's good, and it's probably one of the first things that we should do when you think really about the importance of everything. We can always rebuild buildings, but we can't rebuild people, so planning for employee safety is probably at the top of the list.
Correct.
Okay, this section focuses on claims prep and management issues. Large property claims are complex. You've got deductibles, you've got your primary insurance policy, you may have excess property policy players, you've got FEMA if you're a public entity, and then you even have NFIP policies as well. And so it's important to understand that you need to streamline the process and create one universal claim package that remains fluid and flexible, so that as your claim process evolves, you can put the pieces together and understand what uninsured exposures need to go to FEMA and what types of losses are eligible within your self-insured retention or your deductible structure that FEMA may consider, and really to minimize any duplication of efforts in creating a claim for each specific outside party. Moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, so, Deb, we had a question that came in. It was really, I think it's concerning the type of documentation they need during the claim, and the questions about the value of having live videos of the damage as it's happening.
You know, video evidence is important regardless of which phase of disaster it falls into. A lot of times, you know, there may be questions about how the asset was damaged, you know, whether there was pre-existing issues or it's directly related to the disaster event. And so if you have live video footage of the disaster happening where you can truly measure water levels and, you know, the wind impact, that'll certainly help you link your losses back to the disaster event. So if that's available, absolutely, it'll certainly help you through the claims process. Great question. So we've developed sort of 4 phases of the claim management preparation scenario. Phase 1 is the emergency response, and this is when you're really trying to control the chaos. So your disaster recovery team that you establish, as well as in your emergency response vendors, will help you shorten this emergency response phase so that you can work towards phase 2. And phase 2 is probably the most challenging, and this is scope of damage. Reaching scope agreements during the adjustment process is critical, and it's very difficult because you're always running into pushback, whether it be from the adjustment team or FEMA. So it's important for you to understand who's going to be on your team to identify those damages, and more importantly, defend the scopes of work associated to those damages, whether the asset was damaged and can be repaired, or whether the asset was damaged beyond repair and needs to be replaced. You may need to consider some internal technical resources that understand the technical assets and operations of your systems, or you may need to bring in some outside experts to help you justify your repair and replacement decisions. Phase 3 is the prove-up and support. This is more of an accounting exercise, and we'll touch on some accounting protocols that you can implement later to help you measure, quantify, and support your actual losses. And then phase 4 is the settlement and closeout. And so the more planning you can put ahead of time, the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 is going to help you reach phase 4 sooner, and speed really matters. So, you know, the clients that we've seen that can get to phase 4 sooner than others certainly typically reach favorable settlement outcomes. Okay, potential scope areas. You know, we typically encourage policyholders to capture their losses in the 4 main categories. You've got building claims, you've got your equipment and content claims, you've got your business interruption claims, and you've got your extra expense and expediting claims. Outside of these categories, there's subcomponents that factor into the measurement process. You've got debris removal that we've touched on, code issues that we've touched on, alternate projects. This is FEMA specific. It's where you may not go back the way you were. FEMA puts you back in the same condition you were before the loss, but it may not make sense to invest federal dollars into an inefficient system before. So FEMA has this alternative project that you can consider where at a discounted rate you can do something completely different with the FEMA funding. Brett talked about contingent BI already. I think hazard mitigation is very important for you public entity listeners out there. FEMA welcomes 406 and 404 mitigation. 406 is directly related to the disaster event, where FEMA will consider improvements or resiliency type measures to minimize similar peril from causing similar damage in the future. 404 mitigation does not always have to be directly related to damage elements. Instead, it's administered by the state, where the federal government provides the state a portion of disaster relief funding that can be dedicated to 404 mitigation. So if you're a public entity, I really encourage you to explore these mitigation opportunities that are available out there.
The last sort of sub-entity I want to touch on is the one in the bottom right corner, 50% rule. FEMA has a black and white 50% rule where if the estimated repairs are greater than 50% of the estimated replacement cost, you're entitled to full replacement. Now, unfortunately, FEMA will sometimes use that against you, where if you're making a replacement claim and they'll put together a repair estimate that's less than 50%, and they'll argue that you're only entitled to a repair. But I think the idea here is that you need to consider and think about this cost-benefit analysis so that as you work through decisions of either making repairs to get your assets back up and running again or considering replacement, it's important to work through that cost-benefit analysis so that you can justify those decisions and maximize your recoveries through the claims process. Moving on to the next slide.
Yes, I would note that we have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. So I think this is a real important slide, again, for public entities to understand the interplay between FEMA and insurance. Now, FEMA will consider eligible uninsured losses, and examples of those uninsured losses are deductibles, losses above the policy limits, certain policy exclusions, and so you really want to understand FEMA's process so that you can sort of marry those together and maximize your total recovery. The last bullet I want to talk about here is the not the last bullet, but the FEMA policy and maintain. If you've received FEMA assistance in the past, you really need to make sure that you're carrying adequate coverage today, because if you're not comply with FEMA's insurance purchase requirements, you may not be eligible for future FEMA assistance of the same peril. So it's really important that you consider that moving ahead. Here's some suggested record-keeping ideas for claims. I encourage you to share this with your finance or accounting team so that you can implement some claim tracking protocols to help you support and measure your losses. I don't really have time to get into these, but I think it could be used as a good takeaway tool. And then, again, documentation is so critical, and here's some examples of different types of documentation that you can use to help support your total claim. And I'll move it on to your last section, Steve.
Okay, well, thanks. We got another question. It's a follow-up to the question around the early warning systems, and this would go to you, Brett. Do customized endorsements need to be set up with a carrier to benefit from a reduced or discounted rate if you have installed an early notification product or software?
It's probably not an endorsement side of things. The endorsement's really changing and having an effect on the policy. But I would say, to the extent that one has a conversation with a carrier mid-term and they agree to change something, then that change is going to be recorded by an endorsement. I think to the extent that one has a conversation with the insurance company about your risk is better and what he wants to benefit, it starts with a conversation, and then depending on the outcome, it will be where and how it gets documented.
That's great, thanks, Brett. And I would encourage anybody who had a question but didn't have time to enter it into the system to reach out to Brett or to Jed. Their information will be included with the deck, and you can reach out to them at any time. So just a very quick recap here. Understand your insurance policies and their applicable coverages. It sounds simple, but it can be a laborious process, and you should sit down with your insurance advisor and go through them and make sure you appreciate what you are and are not covered for. And then certainly understand what's not insured so you can take appropriate action to mitigate that risk. Have an updated schedule of insured values ready. You will need that. Generate a list of key personnel and current contact information, because once the disaster hits, you might not be able to get access to it, so make sure it's in a safe place and easily accessible remotely. Understand your current procurement restraints and regulations, and update your disaster recovery plan frequently. And you should really do mock disaster trials at least annually, and have some kind of decision tree or also notification tree, so that there are people who will be responsible for notifying other members within your business about what to do and where to go in the event of a disaster. So this really brings us to the end of the presentation. The checklist that we've been referring to is already posted at this site, at this link, the Connecticut government website. But again, we will also send you that separately in an email, as well as these additional contacts here, as well as